Good evening. I'm very happy to be there. So I will state a general project of a book I published a couple of months ago, The Enlightenment in the Age of the Living. I will indicate a challenge I have sought to take up, how to defend the Enlightenment in the current ecological, technological, and political context when its project of individual and collective emancipation is under attack from all sides, from the right as well as from the left. How can the Enlightenment be defended after the tragedies of the 20th century, after Auschwitz, Hiroshima, after the colonial crimes that led to the suspicion that all universalism is imperialist? Not to mention the ecological, sanitary, and economic counterproductivity of our development model. In the first 2 points, I will distinguish the anti-Enlightenment from the criticism coming from postmodernism, from feminists and postcolonial studies. After having referred to the events and epistemological changes that separate us from the past Enlightenment, I will briefly introduce the resources I used to promote a non-hegemonistic rationalism and a new Enlightenment. Thirdly, I will quickly establish my diagnosis by making a genealogy of nihilism, aiming to explain the inversion of progress into regression, for which the Enlightenment of the 18th century is not responsible, but from which it has not preserved us. I will speak of a double amputation of reason that goes back to the instrumental rationalism manifested in late modernity, but also to a more original separation between nature and culture. This dualism between nature and culture is the vice of our civilization, and the new Enlightenment I seek to promote aims at eradicating it. Afterwards, I will introduce in point 4 the two major categories of the book, namely the notion of scheme as well as the notion of civilizational epoche. And in the last 2 points, I will briefly try to find out why the new Enlightenment is ecological, why ecology understood as a wisdom of our inhabitation of the earth as an emancipatory force, and why this new Enlightenment requires a decentering of democracy. It will be the last 2 points. So first, point 1, the Enlightenment refers less to a century or a continent than to an attitude that is characterized by a critical relationship with our present. Michel Foucault says that. This reflexivity makes it possible to become aware of the challenges to be met in order to renew the link between theory and practice. The idea that the future is not fixed and that it depends on the way in which meaning is established, by freeing ourselves from false or outdated representations, testifies to the importance of freedom of thought and autonomy. So thus, Enlightenment is the unfinished process by which, in every age and on several continents, some human beings try to affirm the value of freedom. This ideal of both individual and collective emancipation explains why the Enlightenment is always associated with a project of society that bases social and political organization on the autonomy of subjects and not on a hierarchical and theocratic order. The importance of freedom of thought goes hand in hand with the recognition of the moral equality of persons, as well as with the project of establishing a society based on this equality in dignity. Thus, autonomy and the democratic ideal are the first 2 pillars of the Enlightenment, and they go hand in hand with the conviction that humanity is one. This assertion that is embodied in the philosophy of human rights is the 3rd pillar of the Enlightenment. Finally, the Enlightenment is inseparable from the affirmation of the importance of reason as a means of access to universalizable principles. These principles enable us to build a society on what we have in common and to free ourselves from superstition, fanaticism, as well as the tyranny of certain customs. These four pillars are opposed point by the anti-Enlightenment, which defends a contrary project of society based on a hierarchical order founded on tradition or on an essentialism that justifies the subjugation of certain beings by others, women, minorities, and so on, and even anti-Enlightenment nourishes racist prejudices. The anti-Enlightenment rejects equality, restricts the individual to his or her ethnic or even biological affiliation, and conducts identity politics that are contrary to the pluralisms that constitutes democracy. Its contempt for human rights feeds its nationalism. The anti-Enlightenment also believes that particular communities are incompatible. Finally, the anti-Enlightenment displays a contempt for reason that feeds the rejection of mediation, that is, traditional channels of knowledge and representative institutions, and this benefits conspiracy and populism. But the Enlightenment, which was born in the 18th century, but which is an intellectual structure. The Enlightenment and the anti-Enlightenment are intellectual structures. But the Enlightenment is also criticized on the left by the postmodernists. However, the latter, the postmodernists, are not anti-Enlightenment. Indeed, feminists and postcolonials rightly accuse the post-Enlightenment of having been hegemonic and blind to differences. However, the criticism that aims to denounce the violence of Enlightenment rationalism does not lead to the rejection of the Enlightenment project of establishing an inclusive society. On the contrary, it is on behalf of the Enlightenment ideals, freedom, equality, justice, that postmodernists denounce the false universalism of the post-Enlightenment, a universalism that was a way of imposing a partial point of view by hiding itself behind supposedly general principles. Thus, the criticism of the postmodernism must be taken seriously. However, it's not a reason to throw all universalist ideals overboard. If we want to build a common project and fight against global warming, the scourges of economism, the drifts of today's technology, the rise of nationalism, we need universalism reference points. This is why I propose to rethink the Enlightenment by introducing a contextual and lateral universalism, welcoming the diversity of life forms and cultures. There is only one planet, one humanity, and a diversity of cultures and perspectives that each represent ways of shaping the world, as Merleau-Ponty says, from whom the expression lateral universal is borrowed. This universalism, which is neither hegemonic nor overbearing, will be based on the phenomenology of corporeality, which shed lights on our human condition, not on human nature, on our human condition, by taking our carnal and earthly conditions seriously. This phenomenology of corporeality I have developed in my previous book shows or testifies or shows our community of destiny, and it's based on the description of the fact that we all are begotten, that we are vulnerable beings, and so on. Also, large parts of our identity are socially constructed. We all are mortal and begotten, dependent on environments and elements. We eat and live on things, natural and cultural things. We occupy space, inhabit the earth, and then we always have an impact upon the others, be they human and non-humans. And this sheds a new light on our human condition, and it has far-reaching political consequences. My hypothesis is that the Enlightenment project must be defend it for several reasons. It's my second point. Because it is under attack by the anti-Enlightenment. And this attack has concrete manifestations, the reawakening of nationalism almost everywhere in the world, xenophobia, the theocratic temptation in some countries, but also transhumanism, which to my mind pertains to anti-Enlightenment because it's opposed to autonomy, the future is fixed and does longer need us, and individuals is riveted to his technological equipment, which replaces the old, ancient essentialism of yesteryear. Transhumanism does not foster democratic society, but a hierarchical order. It illustrates the reversal of rationality into mythology. So the entire Enlightenment have sometimes a new face. But the Enlightenment must be defended also because its pillar still makes sense. However, it's important to rethink them, to reconfigure them. For instance, autonomy has to be reconfigured in the light of our vulnerability and interdependence. We also have to articulate our autonomy to responsibility. Our freedom is modified from within by the sense of our responsibility towards others, human and non-human, and this responsibility is now hyperbolic because of our democratic weight, our ecological footprint, and because of globalization, because we unwittingly create image beings really far away from us and who are sometimes not yet born. In order to reorientate technologies, which in the 18th centuries were backed by a project of emancipation and education, we need reference points to build a viable society. We need to fight against all forms of discrimination and prevent any one group from imposing its own narrative. So it's necessary to think about what we have in common instead of focusing on what sets us apart. In other words, we have to accept the criticism leveled at Enlightenment by postmodernism, but it's also important to see that relativism benefits the Enlightenment. Only a new Enlightenment can fight against the anti-Enlightenment and allow us to free ourselves from outdated and counterproductive representations, patterns, and ways of producing and being. This will make us free players of the ecological transition, as we will see. So, point 3, we need a new Enlightenment. Why a new? Because we have to, of course, strengthen the pillars of the Enlightenment, but we have to overcome, to criticize in a radical way the dualism between nature and culture, which was the basis of the past Enlightenment. So we have to criticize, to overcome this dualism that opened a cursed cycle, as Claude Lévi-Strauss said, by giving rise to a chauvinistic humanism, leading to discrimination of all kinds. It's by reconciling civilization and nature and overcoming the dualism between nature and culture, but also the dualism between technical and culture, technology and culture, that we can both respond to the postmodernist and promote a non-hegemonic universalism that avoids the reversal of rationalism into rationality. And one of my hypotheses, before speaking too briefly of the way the tools I use, before that, I have to say that there has been a double imputation of reason. In late modernity, that is after the 18th century, when reason, in the 18th century, reason was still the organ of the universal. But after that, the true became confused with the useful, and reason became an instrument of calculation. This instrumental rationalism led to the reification of humans and living beings, but in a more original way, the separation of nature and reason that is characteristic of the Western world is the vice of our civilization. Getting out of the destructive dialectic of modernity implies getting out of what I call the scheme of domination, which is a domination of others and of nature outside, but also inside oneself. That is to say that it's linked to the denial of our vulnerability that we have in common with animals. Taking into account our corporality and our earthly and carnal condition allows us to get reason out of the stranglehold of domination. But what's a scheme? For Kant, the scheme is the link between the understanding and the sensible, and it refers to imagination. For me, the scheme, with a capital S, is the organizing principle of a society. It's the set of conscious and unconscious representations that determine our political choice, our economic and social choices. It's a matrix that organizes the modes of production, assigns a value to certain activities and objects, and intrudes into people's mind, conditioning behavior and colonizing the imaginary. It's a dynamic device, and the organizational structures of the actions and processes it designates is linked to the imagination, which connects representation and affect. To speak of a scheme of society is to say that we are dealing with a coherent whole which imposes a development model and impregnates a civilization. And our society is governed by the scheme of domination, which implies a predatory relationship with nature, the commodification of the living and even of oneself, and constant competition, the need to crush others in order to feel that one exists, the obsession with mastery and external control. The scheme of domination transforms everything, breeding, agriculture, power, social life, into a kind of war. In our time, the scheme of domination takes the form of financial capitalism, which is an organization structures around the rule of profit and the subordination of all activities to the economy. But I coin this notion to say that it does not suffice to denounce capitalism. Domination is deeply uprooted in us. And if we want to promote another development model, we have to eradicate this scheme that explains why we still nourish a system that doesn't make us happy and that exposes us to many risks. This scheme of domination must already be identified, knowing that if we suffer from it, we are also the origin of it. We are the instituting power, to speak like Cornelius Castoriadis. Thus, we can depose what we have instituted. The new Enlightenment implies dethroning this scheme of domination. This requires undertaking a work on oneself that I described in a previous book entitled Ethics of Consideration. This self-transformation implies an enlargement of subjectivity. The one who becomes aware of oneself as a carnal and vulnerable being feels that he or she belongs to a world which is older and larger than himself or herself. This experience, Erlebnis, that I call transcendence, leads to a deep change in one's way of perceiving oneself, one's desires and aspirations. We are then able to make rooms for others, including animals, and to interact with them without exerting our power over them. This self-enlargement gives rise to the desire to pass on an inhabitable earth. But this is not enough. The exit from this scheme completely implies freeing oneself from worn-out representations of models. This emancipation involves a movement against a tearing away from a break with existing norms. It's often provoked by the fact that one has reached an impasse, that one has suffered from a system, and that one also understands that this suffering refers to a global injustice. But emancipation also has a fourth moment. At its peak, it is an affirmation of what one believes in. It's one's capacity to act, to innovate and work, to produce, to live differently, in short, to implement experiments that represent reliable alternatives to our development model. Instead of being locked up in indignation, emancipation culminates in this new autonomy, which is the attestation that makes an inclusive project of society possible. I refer in the book to several experiences that testify to the dialectic between individual and collective emancipation, between individuation and socialization, which is at the heart of emancipation, especially in agriculture. I also insist on the different drivers of social innovation, on the passage from local experimentation to a more powerful movement that could give rise to substantial and structural changes at the level of modes of production and of democratic innovations. But most fundamentally, we have to understand that the new Enlightenment requires a removal of the scheme of domination and the organization of society from the scheme of consideration. The latter means that the decisions have two criteria. First, they aim to encourage freedom, and two, they aim to promote a common world, which is made up of all generations and to natural and cultural heritage. In the scheme of consideration, technology is a condition of my existence, but some technologies are to be denounced and prohibited. This demands a very profound questioning of mental maps and social structures, which I call a civilizational epoch. It's the second cardinal notion of the book, and I borrowed it from phenomenology. It's a Greek term. Philosophy, from Socrates to the 18th century and even to our times, begins with doubt, the questioning of prejudices, the knowledge that we all have beliefs, but that we must try not to think that they are reality. In the 20th century, Husserl, the father of phenomenology, took up this sense of philosophy afresh, developing a method. The latter begins with hypoche, the suspension of the natural attitude of adhering to one's beliefs without knowing that they are beliefs. We all have glasses that make us see the world in a certain way. Hypoche consists of taking off one's glasses in order to understand that there are other points of view. Then it's a question of returning to the acts of consciousness through which things are given to us in order to examine them one by one and understand their meaning, and to understand also that some phenomena or some beings escape us, that we do not constitute them, as Levinas and Merleau-Ponty have shown. This operation implies making an inventory in order to formulate what we value, what we want to keep, what we need to transform, what we need to do away with, and how. It must be undertaken at the individual as well as a collective and civilizational level. This is why I speak of a civilizational epoch. I also acknowledge that escaping this scheme is not an easy task, neither intellectually nor emotionally, not to mention the economic restructuring and the changes in political culture. Feminism, the animal cause, ecology, and the desire of an increasing number of people to live differently are the harbingers of this age of the living. The question is why the Enlightenment in the age of the living is radically ecological, and why ecological as an emancipatory force. Point 5. The new Enlightenment is ecological in the sense that ecology refers to the wisdom or rationality, logos, of our inhabitation of the earth, or oikos. And by taking out how earthly and carnal conditions seriously, by thinking of the human being in its corporeality and materiality, which underlines the fact that to inhabit is always to cohabit with others, human and non-human, we articulate ecology with existence. And in this way, we go beyond the dualism inherent in the philosophies of freedom that have served as a framework for modern and contemporary political theories. For contemporary and modern political theories, to be free meant be torn away from nature, and nature was seen as a backdrop to history. To overcome this framework does not signify that we oppose humanism to ecology, as is often the case with ecocentric and environmental ethics. Neither do we subscribe to amalgams that erase the differences between humans and other living beings. Moreover, ecology is a new humanism. It's new because it's based on the consideration of our earthly and carnal condition, but it's a humanism of otherness and diversity. But I still speak of humanism because it's by starting from the human that we protect animals and nature. The key to the ecological transition is not coercion, but the relationship with oneself, the efforts that individuals and communities must make to change their representations of way of beings. That ecology is a product of the Enlightenment, of this questioning of mental maps of yesteryear. Now, what is the emancipatory force of ecology? Firstly, it implies an understanding of the place of humans in nature and their being with the world and others. It breaks with the nature-culture dualism and the practices that illustrate this chauvinistic view. It also overcomes the biological, social, me-other dualism, and ecology involves recognizing one's dependence on others, including animals and ecosystems. One has to accept one's limits and finitude, so ecology is rethinking the way we represent the human condition, which supposes a relationship to the world that requires more humility. Secondly, ecology asks us to make room for other forms of life, to apprehend diversity and otherness, as well as contingency. Thirdly, it fosters a sense of belonging to the common world. We understand ourselves as travelers in the evolutionary odyssey, as Leopold said. And this dethrones hubris, excess, and the feeling of being the king of creation. It uproots anthropocentrism and the idea that everything that exists is a means to our ends. Instead of having a predatory relationship with the environment to serve one's short-term interests, it reinscribes us in a longer time and space and in the common world. Ecology, in the light of a phenomenology of our inhabitation of the earth and of corporality, renews anthropology. Moreover, it leads to a change in the way we solve problems by encouraging us to have a systemic approach to the economy, work, and so on. To speak of the inhabitation of the earth and of cohabitation with others indicates that ecology has not only an environmental dimension linked to the fight against climate change and the erosion of biodiversity. As Félix Guattari said, ecology also has a social dimension associated with justice toward other generations, other peoples, and other beings. Finally, it has a subjective dimension which refers to our way of thinking about ourselves. Thus, the ecological transition is based on 4 inseparable pillars: the fight against global warming and the erosion of biodiversity; 2, health, animal and human health; 3, social justice, and justice toward animals understood as individual selves. There are somebody behind the fur. This global approach implies ceasing to oppose the end of the world and the end of the month. It also requires a transversal treatment of the issues, which means that we need a political change, a change in political culture. We have to be able to institute the common good by achieving agreements in the midst of disagreements between farmers and vegans and so on. We have to cooperate. Conflictuality is constitutive of democracy, but it presupposes a method. Multiple perspectives on the world have to be brought to light, and this is my final point. Ecology goes hand in hand with the transformation of democracy. It is not only a question of politicizing ecology, but of ecologizing politics. We can no longer remain at the level of a vertical and bureaucratic treatment of issues. Multiculturalism, but also the fact that the consequences of globalization, of global warming, are felt differently in different territories, mean that we do not form an a priori unity. I suggest to renounce the ideal dear to the 18th century of national sovereignty. I am not saying that we are a simple multitude, nor that we should give up on a common project, but the latter implies taking an accurate inventory of the situations, problems, and resources that are different according to the territories. We also need to articulate the horizontal and vertical levels in a different way than in the current framework, with its tendency to conduct public policies in a vertical and decontextual or decontextualized manner. When ecology is approached in an atomistic way, it leads to inadequate decisions. We saw that with the carbon tax and yellow waste, but also it leads to incoherent policies. We say that we must fight against global warming, and we accept a farm of many, many pigs and so on. We have to take into consideration the publics, which, as Dewey says, are people who do not necessarily live in the same place, but whose common interest is the way in which they suffer the indirect consequences of technology, globalization, and global warming. It's important that these audiences recognize themselves as such, but also that they enter into a dialogue with each other and with the representatives. And this requires mediations, media, and institutions. The idea is to decentralize democracy, to make it possible to express multiple perspectives, to enable an accurate diagnosis of the situation to be made with a view of revealing the problems, but also the resources. And this would enable the state to respond to those problems in a contextualized manner, but also by relying on the experiments carried out here and there in the fields of energy, transport, agriculture, personal care, all areas where a vertical and homogeneous approach is often always counterproductive. And the state retains its mission of organizing the various spheres of activities. It even reasserts its role instead of being subject to the law of a deregulated market. Relying on initiatives that bear witness to the relevance of alternative methods of production, it can encourage them. It can also, together with local authorities, anticipate certain problems, such as the loss of many jobs as a result of robotization and artificial intelligence, and contribute to the development of areas that have fallen into despair today. Finally, ecology, thought as the wisdom of our way of living on Earth, involves a different way of sharing wealth and power, of organizing space and making room for others, human and non-human. In conclusion, ecology is not compatible with a scheme of domination, which implies a predatory relationship with nature, the subjugation of other living beings, the commodification of everything, governance by numbers and competition. The ecological transition is the translation on a social and political level of the scheme of consideration in the sense that I defined it in Ethics of Consideration. I underline the moral traits that allow us to live with and for others in fair institutions. Consideration goes hand in hand with the humanism of otherness and diversity and rethinks freedom in the light of our common destiny, vulnerability, and responsibility. As said before, organizing society through the scheme of consideration means that there are two selection criteria: individual freedom and the preservation or even the renewal of the common world. Just to finish, a quotation of Albert Camus, Helen's Exile. Ignorance recognized, refusal of fanatism, the limits of the world and of human beings, the beloved face, beauty at last. Here is a camp where we will join the Greeks. In a way, the meaning of tomorrow's history is not what we think it is. It lies in the struggle between creation and inquisition. Despite the price that their empty hands will cost the artists, we can hope for their victory. Once again, the philosophy of darkness will dissipate over the shining sea. Oh, midday thaw, the Trojan War is fought far from the battlefields. Thank you very much. So I have maybe some questions, so I will try. Do I have some question? No. I have some question. Great. What should be the Enlightenment response to climate change skepticism or denial? How do we avoid falling into dogma when dealing with ecological crisis? Thank you for these provocative questions. To avoid falling into dogma is very important, and I think it's when I say that the ecological transition is not to be reduced to the fight against climate change, but it requires our changing our mental map and eradicating the scheme of domination, which is responsible for all the wars we have, the war against ourselves and against animals. I am saying that the ecological transition is the opposite of violence, domination, and dogmatism. But of course, this is easy to say than to do, and it's very difficult to explain in a few words. But I think that ecology means that you change from within, or your way of feeling yourself. And it is a process. It's not something that is very quick. It's a process of self-transformation. This implies an enlargement of the self. You realize that nature is not something external to you, and that the other living beings are part of the common world, and that you are welcoming in a world which is larger than you and older than you. And that is also, it entails cultural and natural heritage, but it gives a depth to your existence. And if we understand ecology in light of our human condition, in light of a phenomenology of or inhabitation of the world, it is not cut from our existence. It is not cut from an anthropological revolution that leads to change our perceptions, our representations, but also our desires, our affects, and our behavior. And for me, the key to this change is the reconciliation between reason and nature, between the fact that we stop then having this denial of our corporeality. And I think this is why the animal cause, which I do not separate from ecological transition, is very strategic in this connection, because it requires us from understanding not only our responsibility toward the other beings, but also the fact that we share a common a community of destiny. Also, we are very different from the other animals, and the otherness is all important. And the recognition of our finitude, of our corporeality, the recognition and acceptance of our limits, and the ability to make room for the others, to understand that the other escape us, are the opportunity of this self-enlargement. I borrow a lot of things from Levinas, whose key notion was the otherness, and it's very important, and whose phenomenology of corporality refreshes our understanding of human condition. And the word nourishment is borrowed from Levinas, and it's a way of avoiding the word resources, which is instrumental. So, and the Enlightenment response to climate change skepticism, well, I think that we have to renew reason. It is true that there had been a reversal of rationalism into irrationality, and it gave birth to different phenomena which were awful: totalitarianism, but also bureaucracy, the commodification of everything, and so on. But I think that reason is not responsible for this. This is why I try to show that there is a double imputation of reason. Reason has destroyed itself in the late modernity with instrumental rationalism. It has been cut from the moral questioning of what is important in life, but also the dualism between nature and culture gave rise to reductionism and so on. I borrow a lot of things from Husserl, whose Weiner lecture is all important to renew rationalism and enlightenment by recognizing what was wrong with modernity. I think that we have to make a very radical critique of modernity, but on the other hand, we strengthen, we reinforce the pillars of modernity, human rights, democracy, autonomy, and the value of reason as a means to free ourselves from outdated representations and to free oneself from productivism, from all the mental maps that nourishes capitalism and so on, is the new face of enlightenment. So for me, ecology understood in the light of a phenomenology of corporeality, understood in light of this philosophical anthropology, is a new enlightenment. New because it requires a radical questioning of some mental maps, but it's enlightenment because reason is very important, autonomy, democracy, and the idea that there is one planet, one humanity, and a diversity of cultures. Thank you. Is there another question? I think we have a little bit time. Not a lot, but a little bit. Okay, so I think I can say you bye-bye, and I'm very sad that we do not have the chance to meet, but it will come. It will come soon.